Weddings are accidents waiting to happen. The very first wedding that I officiated, I arrived 1 hour before the wedding was to begin. I was a student pastor in those days. And when I walked into the parlor, it was a hot day down in Kentucky, so very hot. In the parlor, I walked in and there were a whole crowd of people gathered around the wedding cake. The reason? The cake was leaning toward the right. They were busy taking toothpicks and trying to prop up the wedding cake. Eventually, the whole top of the cake collapsed. Then I walked into the sanctuary. I wanted to have a word with the bride and the groom. I thought I smelled just a slight smell of alcohol on the groom's breath. But then later, when we were in the midst of the vows, the groom fainted. He fainted right in the middle of the I do, and a nurse from the congregation came up, and she had a wet towel right away, and she was trying to make him wake up, or come to, as it were. And the whole while that she was working on the groom, the bride said, "I paid a fortune for this wedding. You better wake up right now." And she was saying it just loud enough that everybody in the entire congregation could hear it. Perhaps this is why weddings make me a little, let's just say, nervous. Although I must say that through the years, I finally learned to sit back and enjoy weddings, one of my favorite things to do. But they wouldn't have been my first choice. And today, we're going to notice that Jesus shows up in the Gospel of John for his very first miracle at a wedding. A wedding where he made water into wine. So listen with me to this story in John, chapter 2, starting with verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And then he said to them, "Now, draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water, that it had become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called to the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. In the verse that precedes this story, we are sitting with Jesus with Nathanael. And Jesus was telling Nathanael that he would see great things. He would see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So as we sit there with Nathanael and we walk into chapter 2, we're probably waiting to see something like angels coming down from heaven, or maybe we could see the sea part, something grand and something glorious. Instead, we find Jesus out in the desert country going to a wedding. This is how God's glory is shown. I must confess that back in the day, when I was a young pastor, I have avoided this story. I've avoided this story for half of my ministry, partly because it has made me too uncomfortable, because I just couldn't imagine my Jesus going to a wedding and making wine out of water. I mean, Look at all the other wonderful miracles in the Gospel of John, where he feeds 5,000 people, or he heals a man born blind, or he raises Lazarus up from the dead. These are wonderful things. Why does John place this wine at the wedding in premier position? Miracle number 1. It was totally beyond my understanding. In fact, I always thought back in those days that my Jesus would not stoop to such a thing. I thought my Jesus should be about doing serious work, like rebuking religious leaders or trying to teach those clueless disciples, or perhaps dying on a cross. I didn't think Jesus should be tied up in any of this alcohol stuff, like making wine. It was a long time before I figured out that Jesus had been accused as a wine bibber. Amazing. As far as I was concerned, my Jesus was a teetotaler. He wasn't, if you read the Gospels carefully. So it's taken me a good long life, and thank God I've been given a pretty nice long life so far, for me to come around to understand that Jesus also is a humorous, lighthearted, wonderfully funny person in many places in the gospel. So I want to introduce that Jesus to you today with this story. So we start out by going out to Cana, which is the middle of nowhere in desert country. And we're headed for a wedding party. Now, back in those days, not much went on in these little desert towns. Everybody just worked really, really hard. But whenever a Jewish family had a wedding, whoa, that's when everybody took off work for an entire week, 7 days. And they all went to party. And nobody worried about the kinds of things we worry about in weddings these days, things like making sure the family members are in their right seats, or the groom doesn't faint, or perhaps the cake doesn't fall, or who knows, what the father or the bride is going to say during the toast. All these kinds of things that occupy our minds these days were not a problem for the people back in those days. They all just went out to the groom's place, they hunkered down, and they started partying. And a party went on for 7 days. Now, as we went in toward the middle of the party, we find out that there is a crisis, a wine crisis. The wine is running out. Now imagine, we've got at least three more days of this party. Wine was the centerpiece of the party. Good wine, good party. So when Jesus walked in, his mother was the first to notice. She saw it right away. She said, there, we're running out of wine. And then she runs over to Jesus. Now, Jesus was probably something like 30 years old by now, and he's still taking orders from his mother? Well, not quite. But anyway, she goes to him and says, the wine's running out. Do something. And he looked at her and said, what does that have to do with you and me? My hour has not come. Now, scholars through the centuries have struggled with this particular moment in the story. They've wondered whether Jesus was being impolite to his mother. That would be horrible, right? Or maybe he just was too high and mighty to stoop down to this little problem of making wine. But you know what? The story doesn't bother to explain. It just plunges right along to the next act where Jesus is looking the scene over, and he spots something. He spots 6 very large jars, stone jars of water. Now, those jars of water were put at the door so that people could wash their hands and their feet in that water before they came in to dine or party. Jesus saw those stone jars, and he looked at the servants in the home and said, I want you to go fill those jars all the way up to the brim. Imagine over 100 gallons of water that they had to drag in and put in these jars one by one. Now, this is dirty water. This is water that people wash their feet and hands in. Yuck. But then he turns to the chief steward and he says, I want you to draw out some of that water wine. In the translation, it actually does call it water/wine, because we don't know what it is yet. So the steward draws out the water. He asks for the chief steward to come over. And then the chief steward tastes it, and it is delicious. And he turns to the groom and he says, most people bring out the best wine first, and then they save the awful stuff for later when everybody's drunk. But you have saved the best for last. Well, all of this happened. Nobody even knew what was going on. Everybody was still partying, telling stories. It was a miracle behind the scenes. Jesus didn't even get a chance to get up and take a bow. Did you see what I did? Wasn't this great? Nobody even knew what had happened. The party just went on without any break in the action. You know, it reminds me of that moment in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy's gone into the great and powerful Oz, and she happens to notice on the right side of the great and powerful Oz, there is a man who seems to be rustling a curtain in a little room. And that man says to her, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Jesus is sort of like that man behind the curtain. He's behind the scenes, but he is great and powerful. That's how he's different from the Wizard of Oz. But he's still behind the scenes, working out the situation so that everyone could be comfortable, because Jesus cares about tending all of the people in his family. He didn't want that groom to be embarrassed. He didn't want all the people to run out of wine and not have any joy, because in the Hebrew culture, good wine was a symbol of joy. Wine was brought out at every meal because it was joy. Jesus wanted everything to be taken care of. That's the kind of Savior we have. Jesus right there on the scenes. He didn't have to be high and lifted up. He could do the little things. And the little things gave some of the biggest surprises of all. You know, near the end of John's Gospel, we find another huge stone in the story, like those stone water jars. This is a stone that has been rolled away from the tomb. And there's another Mary there, and she's terrified because the tomb is empty and she doesn't know what to do. But Jesus has already filled that empty tomb up with joy. And it took her a long time to recognize it, but that's what he had done. I have a friend who told me once that he believed that the first thing Jesus did when he walked out of the tomb was to laugh. Yeah, laugh. First place we find laughter in the scripture stories, it's Sarah. When God filled her womb with joy. Jesus filled 6 stone water jars, gallons and gallons, over 600 good bottles of wine, and he provided it for those guests. He rose from the dead and even filled a tomb full of joy. Indeed, he saved the best for last.